Good morning. Thanks for coming this morning. As you just heard, today we want to talk about finding your sweet spot between tradition and innovation. I'd like to start out by talking about one of the papers I did just a couple years ago in the PhD program. And let me tell you the title, first of all. You may get a clue where it's going. The title was Life Takes Visa and Only Morons Take Cash. It had to do with a series of spots that Visa did. Understand that for over 20 years they had the same tagline in their advertising, which was, "It's everywhere," anybody remember? "You want to be." For 20 years that was their tagline. Well, then somebody decided, they got a new advertising agency and they decided to change direction. So they changed it to Life Takes Visa. The way they did it was essentially this. They wanted to juxtapose people using cash to pay for things versus people using Visa. The main idea was that Visa is a lot more convenient. But what happened as the iterations of these things went forth for about 3 years, because it lasted less than 3 years, which we'll get to in a minute, why? More and more, they not only made it kind of fun to use Visa in these spots, they also made it very uncomfortable if people were actually using cash. And very clearly, they became morons. Well, almost as suddenly as those new ads began, Visa stopped them. The question is why? One of the reasons probably is that they got a lot of kickback from people who watched them who didn't like them. Well, why didn't they like them? Because they were very entertaining. Why didn't they like them? One of the things that I would contend is that they forgot that people like both tradition and innovation. And if you move more towards either one or the other to the exclusion of the other, you are going to fail. People are inherently built so that they like to have some things that they're used to that you don't violate too much, but they also like to have something new on the horizon, always that's coming, that's different from what they've been before. And if you're always over here and everything is new, which is what the Visa campaign was, cash is stupid, don't use it, people reacted against that. One of the more classic ones, and you've probably heard a lot of this story before, but I think it's worthy of repetition if you haven't, is what Coca-Cola did back in the mid-'80s. Just after World War II, the market share for the Coca-Cola company's flagship drink was over 60%. By 1983, it had declined to under 24%, mainly because of competition with companies like Pepsi-Cola. That was the main one. When a new CEO took over in 1980, he pointedly told employees that there are no sacred cows around here. And he proceeded to show them exactly what he meant. He's the one who started a bunch of market surveys and questionnaires and that kind of thing, taste testings around the United States, trying to find out, can we have a better formulation of Coke? And it turned out that they could, at least they thought. So they did all this kind of market testing. Did people really like it better? Were they willing to drink it even if it wasn't the old Coke and so forth? The results were really strong. The sweeter mixture, the new one, people did actually like better. But in the focus groups, they kind of neglected this. In those days, the statistical stuff from surveys was given a lot more weight than the focus group stuff. In the focus groups, it became really clear that about 10 to 12% of the people who tried the new Coke, even if they liked the taste, hated the idea that they would dare to change their Coke. Because remember what their tagline was for a long time? It's the what? The real thing. Well, if it's the real thing, why are you changing it? And they hated the idea. Well, they went ahead, they changed it anyway. They introduced the new Coke with big marketing pushes in New York and Washington, D.C. And Coke sales in those two places actually went up about 8% over what they had been the previous year. But then some of the negativity started kicking in. Company headquarters started receiving letters that were expressing anger and deep disappointment over what Coke had done. They got over 400,000 calls and letters, including one that was addressed to, this is one of my favorites, quote, Chief Dodo, the Coca-Cola Company. Another letter asked for his autograph because they thought the signature of, quote, one of the dumbest executives in American business history would likely become valuable in the future. The company's hotline, which was 1-800-GET-COKE, received 1,500 calls a day compared to 400 before the change. They even hired a psychiatrist at Coke to listen in on these calls. And he told executives that some people sounded as if they were discussing the death of a family member. The most alienated customers simply refused to buy the new Coke. But they purchased large quantities of the old Coke and stashed them. Some people did thousands of dollars worth of this stuff. Finally, the corporate board of Coca-Cola decided that enough was enough, and they decided to bring back the old Coke. Coca-Cola executives, this is a killer to me, I didn't remember this. Coca-Cola executives announced the return of the original formula, although even then it was a little different from what it was before, on July 10th, which was less than 3 months after all of this stuff introducing the new Coke. Do you know how ABC News announced the change? Peter Jennings interrupted General Hospital to share the news with viewers. And on the floor of the U.S. Senate, David Pryor called the reintroduction of the old Coke, quote, a meaningful moment in U.S. history, on the Senate floor. The company hotline received 31,600 calls in the 2 days after the announcement. They scrambled for a long time to try to figure out what had happened. And in the end, by the way, there's a coda to the story. It didn't really hurt them because the generated interest in this stuff, they actually ended up selling more old Coke than they used to before the change. So in effect, it actually helped them. But the new Coke, the introduction of it was an abject failure just from the standpoint of the new Coke. But why? At a press conference, Coke's president said, the simple fact is that all the time and money and skill poured into consumer research on the new Coca-Cola could not measure or reveal the deep and abiding emotional attachment to original Coca-Cola felt by so many people. It's exactly what we've talked about at the beginning. What Coca-Cola executives forgot, and what is very easy to forget, especially in a culture that focuses so much on innovation and what's new and what do we need to do next, is that people are naturally geared to move between those two poles of tradition and innovation. And what the new Coke did was say, the old stuff, that doesn't make it. What we want is over here. And even though it was only 10 to 12%, exactly what the focus groups told them, who just strenuously objected, they affected the opinion of a lot more people, which generated that, in that 3 months, the change back to the old Coke. They forgot about that difference, that continuum between tradition and innovation. It reminds me of one of my favorite movies from the mid-'80s was Back to the Future. Most of you probably have seen it, some of you haven't, but in the story, he goes back in time and changes things and so forth. Well, towards the end of the movie, there's a really telling scene for what I want to talk about. Marty McFly, who's the hero of the thing, is playing at a prom dance, and it's not going really well, and finally he decides to play some music that happened after their time, but not too much after their time. He starts playing a Chuck Berry song, and everybody loves it. And one of the musicians who had been hired gets on the phone. He says, Chuck, this is Marvin. You got to listen to this. And in the movie, it's Chuck Berry's cousin. And he holds out a phone and he listens to this Chuck Berry tune. Well, then Marty McFly decides, well, if they like that, they're really going to like this. And he plays, I think it's a Van Halen thing, with his screaming guitar. And as soon as he starts to do it, the whole crowd goes deathly quiet. And they're looking at him like, what is that? And he says, you hate it, but your kids are going to love it. It's exactly the same point here. Do you know why they hated it? Because it had no bearing on their tradition. There was no way they could connect to it. It was innovative for them. It was new. It was different. But they hated it because there was no way for them to connect it. That's what we have to remember when we're talking about innovation, whether it's about products that we develop, or internally, the kind of teams that we put together to work on innovative stuff, or our marketing stuff, or messages to people on the outside. If we do not keep in mind that people tend to move between those two borders of tradition and innovation, we're going to be in trouble. Maybe the best example of that currently, not being in trouble but doing it right, is Apple. Apple came out with the iPad back in April of 2010. I'm real familiar with a lot of this stuff because my dissertation, which I just finished, is all about this stuff. They came out with the iPad in 2010. When they came out with the iPad 2 a year later, it looked pretty much the same. There were certain things that were different and features that were different. And now when they came out with, they don't call it the iPad 3, but the next generation iPad, Again, it looks pretty much like the same iPad. And there have been a number of critics, if you listen to them on the web, who have said, why are you doing that? You had the perfect opportunity to try new stuff, blah, blah, blah. Apple understands that people like certain things the same, but they also want to see certain new things. You have to keep moving between those two poles and never in a static place. It's different from time to time. So at some points you concentrate more on tradition. At other points you concentrate more on innovation, but it's constantly moving. Apple knew that if it gave people a completely new product, they risked doing what Coke did. And so they've been very careful about not doing it. Although we live in an era that worships innovation and change, history would seem to teach us that innovation and tradition need each other more than we realize. When I started thinking about this in the PhD program, I started developing something that I call the oscillation principle, which again has tradition at one end, innovation at the other. So it's anchored firmly at both ends, whatever you do, but it moves freely in the middle. Groups or organizations that thrive have to communicate their story or introduce new products or speak to their audience, whatever the particular challenge is, in ways that highlight both the traditions and roots of the organization or the person, as well as its desire to innovate and change. Its communication, therefore, has to anchor the organization or the product in a particular history, even as they work to spur it to a new place and territory. Which end of the spectrum receives the most attention at any given time depends entirely on the current conditions. Groups that emphasize one of these poles or the other to the exclusion of the other almost invariably will fail. In other words, human beings need both the expected and the surprising in ever-changing doses. A steady diet of one to the exclusion of the other will lead to serious difficulty in the life of the organization. That seems to be a built-in, inherent, innate human characteristic. I got married late in life, not till I was 41. We didn't have kids for 7 years because my wife was trying to get some mercury out of her system. So I now have 2 kids, 2 daughters, one who is 5 and one who is almost 7. Everybody else in my circle of friends have kids that are graduating from college and getting married. In fact, this last summer, I officiated at the wedding of the little boy then who served as our ring bearer. And my daughter was his flower girl. It was kind of fun. But it showed me the difference. It's amazing when I watch Katie and Lauren how they illustrate this principle for me. And I didn't really start thinking about it until I started looking at some other things I'm going to talk about in a minute. They love new stuff, but it comes with a big caveat. There are certain other things that they're used to and they like, and if you try to deviate from that, no way. I have a pretty good ear, and so over the years, I pick up a lot of different accents, and every once in a while, I'll use them, whether in speaking or when I'm reading books to Katie and Lauren. But very often, when I use one of these accents, like if it's a book in Spanish, and oración, I start talking like this, and it's very difficult oración time for them to understand. So, but when I do that, they'll go, Katie in particular will go, Daddy, talk in your own voice. She does not like that kind of change. In other contexts, she does. I think that example speaks to the large mass of humanity. There are certain things that we like to see basically the same, and certain other areas where we like to see change. And if we don't keep those 2 poles in mind, you're going to be in trouble. Now, both in my work as a book editor and in my life of faith, I suppose I first started seeing that clearly in the Bible. As I read it, there were certain times where tradition was really emphasized and certain times when it was not. Regardless what you think of the Bible or the Christian faith or anything else, it's interesting because that book has shaped our Western culture. And if in there you see this constant oscillation between tradition and innovation, and it still is a potent force today, it probably says something about the human condition and not just about that particular book. 2 years ago, I took my last class in the PhD program. I took it in Oxford, England. It was on C.S. Lewis, who is one of my favorite authors. So we went around Oxford and we went to the pub where he hung out, which was fun, and his house, and we stayed at in one of the schools in Oxford and so forth. And by the way, this has nothing to do with the talk, but it's kind of fun to get up in the morning and start walking on the streets of a city where just in the distance you see something called New College. Do you know why it's called New College? Because it wasn't founded until 1383. That's why it's New College. Lewis wrote a book called Screwtape Letters, and it came out in about 1946. It's one of his most famous ones and kind of put him on the map. And it's an allegory, kind of a satire allegory, where he imagines that there's this senior demon who's giving this younger tempter demon some advice on how to get people to do nasty things. And it's fascinating for its insight into human character. And at one point, when we were doing this class, I remember reading this. This older demon called Screwtape writes this. He says, as spirits, humans belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. This means that while their spirit can be directed to an eternal object, their bodies, passions, and imaginations are in continual change. For to be in time means to change. Their nearest approach to constancy, therefore, is undulation. And this is the point I want you to get. The repeated return to a level from which they repeatedly fall back. A series of troughs and peaks. If you had watched your patient, meaning the guy he's trying to tempt, carefully, you would have seen this undulation in every department of his life. His interest in his work, his affection for his friends, his physical appetites, all go up and down. As long as he lives on earth, periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness will alternate with periods of numbness and poverty. What Lewis called the law of undulation is what I would call the principle of oscillation. That's what people constantly do. They're not either at one end of the pole or at the other end of the pole. Naturally, they move between both. But it's not always at the same point. Which is why when you think about your companies, when you think about your even personal life, how you deal with people, your organizations, whether you're in a group or a church or whatever, those two things have to be kept in mind. Because if you go too far if you go too far to tradition, you ossify. You become completely incapable of responding to the culture around you. If you go completely to the other end, everything is new. Now you become really shallow and you become out of date tomorrow. Somehow we've got to navigate between those two poles, what he would call the law of undulation. Now think of where you are right now. As a group, all Oregonians tend to think of themselves as pioneers. I came from the Midwest and I noticed that right away, and it's still true today, I think. They're self-sufficient frontiersmen on the cutting edge of discovery. Other states may have self-serve gas, but not us. Other states may have sale taxes, but not us. We're different. We're innovators. We're adventurers on the wild frontier. Let's keep Portland weird. But think about the origin even of the city's name, Portland. Why Portland? It's because Francis Pettygrove of Portland, Maine, won a coin flip with Asa Lovejoy of Boston, Massachusetts in 1845 to the right to name the city. It was a new city, yes, but it had some connection to the old, at least mentally. Innovation has to exist to some degree within at least a mental framework of tradition. And so today we see New York and New Jersey and New Hampshire. There still are places called York and Jersey and Hampshire, but they've largely been eclipsed by the new ones. Think of your own context for a moment, whether at work or in some other organizational situation. If man does not live by innovation or tradition alone, but by an ever-changing combination of the two, then what does that say for you or for your group or for your company? Are you leaning too heavily either towards innovation or tradition? How can the two supplement each other, in other words, in order to work best with the way humans actually tend to operate in the real world? Just a couple weeks ago, on a trip to Texas, I finished reading a fascinating new book, just came out last month, called Imagine How Creativity Works. Brian Uzzi, who's a Northwestern University sociologist, spent 5 years studying thousands of old musicals on Broadway to investigate group creativity. Now, here's just another example of how this principle works. He wondered, was it better to put together a group of close friends or total strangers? He wasn't the author of the book. He was quoted in the book. He studied nearly every Broadway musical produced between 1877 and 1990. Which is a total of 2,258 productions. That is a lot of stuff to study. He developed something he called Q, which was a measure of the social intimacy of the people involved in each of the production. Strangers to each other had a low Q. Close and frequent associates had a high Q. He found that when the Q was low, less than 1.7, musicals were much more likely to fail. Now, that's not surprising. But on the other hand, he also found out that when the Q was high, above 3.2, the work also suffered. Why? Because collaborators brought in too many similar patterns. They thought in too similar of ways, which tended to crush innovation. In the 1920s, there were a lot of flops on Broadway, even though it had some of the biggest stars and brightest lights of that day. It had people like Cole Porter and Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart and Oscar Hammerstein II. Uzzi found that the kind of team that led to the greatest success had intermediate levels of Q. Ideal, he found, was 2.6. Such a group was 2.5 times more likely to produce a commercial success than low Q or high Q. It was also 3 times more likely to get praised by the critics. The author of the book, Joshua Lehrer, wrote this. This led Uzzi to argue that creative collaborations have a sweet spot. That's what we started talking about this morning. Quote, the best Broadway teams by far were those with a mix of relationships. Remember, oscillating between tradition and innovation. These teams had some old friends, but they also had newbies. This mixture meant that the artists could interact efficiently. They had a familiar structure to fall back on, but they also managed to incorporate some new ideas. They were comfortable with each other, but they weren't too comfortable. That's page 115. Example he gives is West Side Story, which came out in 1957. That's the year I was born. It was considered radical for Broadway at the time. It told a lot of the story through songs, which you didn't do. It did a lot of long numbers, which you didn't do. It had a lot of things that were radical for its time. It had some old hands who put it together, Jerome Robbins, Leonard Bernstein, Arthur Lawrence, but it also had some new ones. There's a 25-year-old lyricist they hired who had no Broadway experience named Stephen Sondheim. They let him write the words to the songs. They also had Peter Gennaro, who was an assistant to Robbins, who provided a lot of important ideas for the choreography. Both of those guys, you may know, went on to huge success. But at the time, they were newbies. Uzzi again writes, quote, people have a tendency to want to work only with their friends. It feels so much more comfortable, but that's exactly the wrong thing to do. If you really want to make something great, then you have to seek out some new people too. So tradition and innovation, or the familiar and variety, or the old and the new. You don't find success, tend to, in one or the other, but in an ever-changing mix of the two. If you want to find your sweet spot, that is where to look. Any questions?
So, questions for Steve?
How would you characterize nostalgia as an element of tradition?
Oh, how would you characterize nostalgia as an element of tradition?
Yeah, it's definitely there. I mean, it's obviously on the tradition side of things. People, in fact, that in the Coke situation, that was mainly what it was. It was nostalgia. It wasn't the taste. In fact, I didn't talk about this, but later they did some testing with some of those people who most strenuously objected, and they made them do, they didn't make them do, they asked them to do a blind taste test, and they still picked the new stuff. And when they found out it wasn't the old Coke, they got angry because they had a nostalgic commitment to the old Coke. But you forget about that at your own peril, which Coke did. Now again, with them, ultimately it didn't end up hurting them. A lot of other companies, it's hurt a great deal.
Yes?
Good topic, thank you. For
You have recommendations for those of us in business for how to find that sweet spot between tradition and innovation?
The first thing I think is just to recognize that it exists. Because we live in a culture that so consistently talks about innovation and new and getting rid of the old, that if you start listening to those voices entirely, you forget about this end of things and you'll wind up in trouble. Part of it has to do with what I talked about in that last example with Broadway musicals. I think companies that succeed are going to very consciously start putting together teams that are kind of along that range. It's not just because you need some newer blood because the older ones are going to die off or retire. It's because of that kind of collaboration that mixes. In the book, Imagine, Lehrer book, which is fascinating, by the way, I really highly recommend it. He talks about some of the companies that are really putting some of these things into place. They don't call it what I just did, but that's what they're doing. For example, Pixar does it, 3M does it. A lot of companies that are the most innovative tend to specifically and very intentionally hire newer people and older people. And then it's not that they hire them and then they put them in their separate offices. They create structures within their business so that they can freely associate. Because that's the milieu out of which most creativity happens. It doesn't happen in meetings. It doesn't happen in structured environments. It's where people meet on the fly. Something comes up, they start talking about it, it generates an idea and somebody takes off with it. That's where their best ideas happen. It happens at Pixar, it happens at 3M, it happens in a lot of these companies. One of the interesting things, this is a sidelight, one of the ways not to do it, I was taught, in brainstorming sessions, this is just an example that you'll get from that book. In brainstorming sessions, you open up the floor and you ask people to generate ideas, but you very carefully do not criticize them because the theory is, that shuts down the creativity. They've done a number of studies on that over the years. It sounds great, the only thing is it doesn't work. It's not true. And so Pixar has developed a model, which he highly recommends, and it makes sense to me, that when they have their creative sessions, when they're talking about a storyline, and every morning they meet in this room that has a screen where they show what they've already done, they do criticize. Somebody comes up with an idea, but they add this, that whenever you criticize, you also have to have a good idea, so you can't just sit in there and complain about everybody's idea. And what tends to happen is that, yes, it feels a little bit more uncomfortable, but it does not hamper those ideas, it increases them. And the end of it is a much better product, although it sometimes tends to take a little longer. When they do the traditional classic brainstorming, they don't get a lot of ideas, and most of them aren't that great. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Yes.
How does this work in families?
Oh, how does this work in families?
Thank you. I think it's a great question, and it does work in families. In ours, for example, we're a little different demographically than most people because I'm 55. I won't tell you how old my wife is, but she's quite a bit younger. And we have 2 kids who are 5 and almost 7. You have to very consciously approach certain things, that there are certain times of the year. For example, holidays are great at this. And you'll see the same thing in organizations and in churches and that kind of thing, but the same thing works in families, is that there are certain things they want to see the same all the time, and if you deviate, you're in trouble. So there are certain things you do at Christmas. There are certain things you put up at Easter. There are certain things that you do at Halloween, in particular, that if you deviate from that, you're in trouble. And yet, like for Halloween, they want to be something new every year. They want to try something different. They want to be challenged. They want to think of things in a new way, but it has to be within that context. Families have to think through those things, I think, in all of those areas. That not only in terms of holidays, that's probably the best quick example, but also in terms of how you operate. You have to make sure that you generate enough new things, that the family is constantly challenged in new directions, and is in contexts where they see different things which will generate new ideas. That's basically how new ideas get generated, is that you're in a different context than you're used to. You see something done in a different way, and you start to think, oh, what happens if I took that and I applied it over here? If you're always in the same place, you'll never generate any of that new stuff. The same thing is true in families.
Oh, how does that apply in communications in terms of the medium versus the message?
Yeah, it depends on what the message is. I think that in many cases, for example, I told you earlier I'm a person of faith. When I'm thinking about my Christian faith, that message itself doesn't change. Lewis himself said innovation in theology, you want to stay away from that as much as you can. But He also said towards the end of his life, somebody interviewed him and they asked him, Dr. Lewis, in your years teaching at Oxford, and then he spent his last few years at Cambridge, which is an interesting story in itself, what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind about writing? Now, if you knew C.S. Lewis, you might expect him to say something like, it's the message. You make sure that the message is clear, or that sort of thing. You know what he said? You know what is the most important thing in writing? Entertainment. They went, what? So you have to understand, Lewis was not only a writer of things like the Chronicles of Narnia and stuff that has been made into movies, but he also was a classic scholar who was highly recognized. Some of his texts are still used in classes today, and he died in the same day that JFK died. What he meant was that you first have to get somebody's attention before you can teach them anything. That's why he wrote the way he did in his fiction, in Screwtape Letters and so forth. It was to try to get people's attention. And he knew that you have to do it in a different enough way so that they just don't tune you out. But at the same time, he had a specific kind of message that he wanted to communicate. He wanted to try to make sure that that didn't morph into something else. So does that help?
Yes.
Do you think, it's an election year, so there's a lot of talk about extremism, plus you see it around the world, in different societies. Do you think that somehow those folks might be missing part of this societal condition or societal change that they're all announcing?
Yeah, I think that's true, both in terms of the message, but also the way they deliver it. For example, I've never understood, as a communications guy, I've never understood why when somebody is challenging an incumbent, they'll try to use exactly the same methods that the incumbent uses. So if the incumbent is using a certain kind of attack ads or whatever, or they're bringing in these heavy guns to say, how dangerous this person is, or they're an extremist. That's the common thing today. You don't call people Nazis, but basically you are. And the other group that's trying to catch up will try to use the same stuff. That will never work. You will never win a slugfest in that kind of thing. You have to gain people's attention in a new way. And so I've often wondered, why don't they at least try? It might not work, but if you're going to lose anyway, you might as well try something new. Why not at least try a very different approach for political advertising? So, for example, you walk up to the camera and you say, my candidate just called me a Nazi. Do I look like a Nazi? Here's you're just talking very calmly to the camera. You're presenting a message. Your message isn't changing, but the style of it is. And what that does is what Lewis was talking about with entertainment. You have to grab their attention. If you're trying to slug it out in the same way, you are going to lose. You have to try something new. It may not work, but if it does, then you can see some change. So I think that's what my guess is when these things really heat up, especially the presidential race, you're going to see two groups basically trying the same kind of ads over and over and over again. And it's very hard for the non-incumbent to win unless the level of discomfort for the population has risen to the point where it can work.
We have time for one more question. So how does this work for remote meetings where we're calling in or not face-to-face? How do we get that innovation in those kind of situations?
I'd say it's possible, but it's harder. Because one of the things that all kinds of studies on creativity show is that the best stuff happens not by appointment. So if you are trying to generate ideas in an online meeting, it's going to be very difficult because not only do you not have face-to-face and flesh on flesh, it's remote and their attention is usually distracted at some point too. It's harder. But what you can do, I think, is what you do ahead of the meetings. You try to set up situations as much as possible where you're putting your people who are going to be in this meeting in contexts that are different from what they're used to. They're going to be running into people who have different ideas than what they're used to. They're not always in the same cubicle with the same people talking about the same stuff. So you try to figure out ways where that kind of percolation can happen before you have that meeting. Then sometimes some of those changes, some of those innovations can happen even within that meeting as long as they're getting that outside stimulus. But as long as they're talking to the same people, they're not running into new people, they're not looking at new spots, you're going to find it very difficult to sit down in a... One of the texts that we used in one of my classes was called Speaking into the Air. And the only thing that stuck with me from that book was that he essentially said, we have to keep in mind that people are not disembodied heads. Something happens when people are together in a room physically that does not happen when they don't. And it's not simply because the exchange of information is different, because electronically you can exchange information now pretty much as well as you can sitting face to face. But it's what happens in those unplanned times. It's what happens in those conversations that are off the record when you're in a new context. That's where most innovation, creativity, imagination really begins to spark. Does that help?
Thank you,
No.
Steve.